As Ron said, my name is James Aimonetti. I've been with the project since basically the beginning. You can blame me for making sure that Erlang took hold, or you can thank me, either way. I'm going to talk about how Kazoo does rating, and how Kazoo does limiting, and hopefully I'll stop breathing into the mic. And hopefully give you some pointers on how to turn it all on and check that it's working the way you expect it to. There should be a mixture of topics for businessy people and system admins. More for the system admins than the businessy people, sorry. So I'll try and go quickly so we don't get bored to death. All right, so let's talk billing real fast. We get requests for, I just need a simple solution. But at the end of the day, people don't realize how much there is that goes into a full billing solution. For instance, do you want to support recurring subscriptions? Do you want to do prorated? Are you going to charge activation charges for DIDs, for phones, for what have you? Are you going to do per minute? Right, so there's all these different things that you could potentially want to use to do your business, okay? And there's a lot of things going on here to provide a full-featured billing solution. So this is not something that we can just whip up for you in a day. It takes time, it's complex, there's a lot of testing and validation involved. Anytime money is involved, we want to be extra careful, okay? So I've got 3 slides dedicated to this, just to show some of the conversations around billing that we go through, each of which takes time and effort, testing, whatnot. We saw, Darren showed the 10 steps that we go through with new features. So you can imagine, it's quite a bit of effort. So today we're not going to talk about almost any of that, because it's just too much and it's frankly boring. So what we will talk about is rating. What's it good for? We want to assign costs to calls, right? That's what rating is. So in Kazoo, we have a rate document that you can create and post if you're the system administrator. Some of the interesting fields that you would set include the prefix. So this is going to be what we're matching on, basically removing the plus from an E164 phone number. The direction that this rate will apply, so you can do inbound versus outbound, or both if it applies to either inbound or outbound. And then you can optionally filter it even more with the routes regexes. So if you wanted to support US only, then you could exclude Canadian, Caribbean, what have you. It also uses +1. The options, this is going to be, if you're familiar with how devices work, you can put flags on a device like a fax device so that it only goes over carriers that support T38 or whatever their arbitrary tags. You can also apply that to your rates, and we will match the route request with the rate. So you can charge differently for a fax call versus just regular voice, things of that nature. And then you can play with the rate increment and minimum. So those are in seconds. So we will, in this case, rate a minimum of 60 seconds regardless of the billing seconds, if they're less than 60 seconds. And we will bill at 60-second increments. And then you can do a surcharge if you want. So no matter what, this call is getting $1 billed, and then the cost of the rate itself. Okay, and so you can create as many rates as you want with all of these fun options. There's a CSV uploader, so you can create your rate deck and upload it. Yeah. All right. So what happens when a rate request is published to MQP? The application is known, or the WAP is known as Hot or Not. If you were around on the internet in like the early to mid 2000s, you hopefully get that reference. Thanks, Josh. I don't know if that was for me, but You have a distinctive laugh. So what do? We receive the request. In this case, this is our office phone number, 415-886-7900. We break it down into a list of prefixes, so 114, 141, 1415, etc. And we use those as keys into Couch, into the rate deck, to look up any rates that match those prefixes. If you're not familiar with Couch, looking up by index is much faster than doing a view, so this is much more efficient. And we get back a result set of potential matching rate objects. From there, we filter by call direction. So if it's an outbound call to your carrier, we will get rid of any that are inbound only rates. Okay, so now we have maybe a smaller subset. Can you read that? So the next step is that we will match that list of options on the rate against the flags and options of the calling device, which will then narrow down even more. And then we'll run any regexes to see if we need to narrow any more. And then we will sort any remaining rates by the length of the prefix. So basically, if you had a prefix of 1 and a prefix of 1415 left, we would choose the 1415. So it's the more specific prefix. Once we've sorted them, we pick the first one that's there, and that's what gets applied to the call. Now, we don't actually do anything billing related at this point. We just add it to the call, the variables that go along with the call, and they will end up in the CDR. Okay? And then Johnny 5, which we'll talk about with limits, we'll see those, and if it is a per minute call, we'll use those rates to deduct from the account. Okay, does that make sense? So we are going to rate, if you have authorization on, we're going to rate every call, whether it is per minute, flat rate, allotment, whatever scenario that the limits determines, there will be rate information on that call. Did I see a hand go up? No, I'm just blind. Okay, once you've uploaded your rate deck and you've massaged your rates, on the back end you can do a query to see what rate would be selected if this number was dialed. So here you can see I put it into my little test server, and I got back an inbound and an outbound, and then a little handy asterisk for telling me which one would have been chosen in this case. And so you can test your rates this way to make sure that the dialed numbers are choosing the correct rates. And if you're not getting the rate you expect, then hopefully with this diagram you can go through and figure out, is my regex wrong, if I set the call direction wrong, things like that. Okay. That's it for rates. Looking to the future, we have a community pull request for supporting basically arbitrary rate decks, more than one rate deck, whether they're tied to an account or are just sort of these nebulous rate decks that you can assign an account to. We're still working through the details and trying to make sure that it is an efficient process. So hopefully in the near future, we'll work through those issues so that you can have multiple rate decks. Maybe you have a premium rate deck, a wholesale, retail, whatever kind of rates you need to offer your customers. Okay? Are there any questions on rates at this point? We can. Yes. So the question was storing the internal cost, right, of what you would be paying to your upstream carrier, right? So these are the rates. This rate cost is what you would be charging your customer who's making the call. You on the back end have costs associated with that carrier. You can set those fields in the back end. It's not exposed through the API, and there's a lot of other fields that go here, but these are sort of the most common. They won't be on the CDR. They would be, you basically, since you have the rate information on the CDR, you can go to that rate and see and calculate your internal cost from that. Currently, we haven't had a feature request to expose that billing information for your internal costs. But the data is certainly there. We would just need to expose the functionality to correlate everything together. Are there any other quick questions on rating? The rating currently today in Kazoo, you have one global rate deck that gets applied across the board. Once we get the pull requests, you'll be able to assign an account to a rate deck. And so then you can have different rate decks for different types of customers. But the mechanism will still be the same of how you determine. It's basically just changing which database is used to search for the prefixes. And then, yeah. So anyway, any other questions? Aren't we excited? I mean, rates, right? All right. Okay. So limits in Kazoo are straightforward-ish. Carl thinks they're very straightforward, but he wrote most of the code. I now kind of think they're straightforward just because I've been looking into them a lot more closely for this presentation. So hopefully I can convey some of that straightforwardness to you. But we'll see. We'll see how we do. Okay. So the first sort of tier of limits are flat rate chunks. These are going to be, for $29.99, you get you can make a phone call as many minutes as you need, right? So you can do inbound only, you can do outbound only, or you can do two-way flat rate chunks. And that basically just means how many simultaneous calls you can make. These calls will still be rated, but any funds that are tracked by Kazoo will not be impacted by a call that is flat rate enabled, okay? Does that make sense? There is also a way to filter based on whether it's a resource consuming call. So if this call is destined for your upstream carrier, that is considered a resource consuming call. And so you could limit those as well. You can use this, for instance, with local carriers. So Kazoo supports bring your own carrier. If you want to have your own stable of carriers and not use the system carriers, you can also enable it to authorize requests to those carriers. So if you're the reseller, you can restrict your account's ability to make too many calls to your local carriers, things like that. We also support the idea of burst. So this is, I would sell you 5 flat rate chunks and your customer service, and it turns out your company's doing a big recall. Perhaps you were cheating your emissions tests. You're probably going to need a few more chunks to handle the outrage, right? So you can assign this account burst chunks, and then it's on you to figure out how you want to bill those. Do you pay more per base chunk to have the option of having the burst functionality? Do you pay the regular rate and then you get charged per burst chunk that you use, right? So you can come up with those strategies. All that information will be in the CDR for you to use in your billing. You can also do what Carl calls bundled chunks. And this is where you can assign all of those inbound, outbound, two-way, resource-consuming, burst. You can basically suffix them with _bundled. And then in the value for that JSON, you can do user or device. And essentially, it will look up how many users or how many devices are in that account. And that's how many of that type of chunk that account gets. Does that make sense? Okay. The next sort of class of billing is going to be, or limiting, is the prepay and postpay. So this is going to be where the rates get applied to the available funds of a particular account. Right? So prepay is you pay $50, you make calls until you reach 0, and then you add more money. Postpay essentially is being able to go negative with prepay. And you can set the threshold of how negative that particular account can go. Allotments are going to be buckets, so you can say this account gets 400 minutes a month. You could say this account gets 1 minute a minute. That does exist, and it is called minutely. But it allows you to do buckets of things. With the mobile stuff, we'll start adding buckets for data and things of that nature. But that's the allotments. That's kind of the third type of limit. Some caveats: emergency calls are immediately authorized. So if you haven't used Kazoo much, there is a classifications list of regexes that help Kazoo classify the type of number being dialed. So things like toll-free, international, if if it's a US DID, those are sort of the defaults. There's also a flag for emergency. And so depending on how your country does emergency calls, we will automatically authorize that call. It will skip the whole process of authorization. The other thing, especially for US, is if it's a toll-free and it's an outbound call, we will bypass all the authorization and just let you make the call, because presumably you're not being billed for it. The CDRs are augmented with this format to show you the trunk numbers when that call was placed, so that for debugging purposes. So if your credit, if the customer's credit was deducted, you can look at the CDR and see that, oh yes, in fact, they were using all of their inbound trunks, so it was appropriate that we went to the per minute billing instead. As well, you can use the burst to figure out whether you're supposed to be billing them extra or not. Okay, so those are kind of the different types of authorization and limiting that we do in Kazoo. So now let's look at this really cool chart that I made. My designer is probably really upset that I didn't run this by him. So when the authorization request comes in, the first thing we look at is for the account doc, there's a PVT enabled flag. So again, if you haven't used Kazoo before, any field that is prefixed with PVT underscore is a Kazoo system flag that is not exposed to users. So you can't, via the APIs, modify this value. This is for system administrators only. We set this to false on the master account so that the master account is always authorized to make calls. And there are other implications. But if for some reason you wanted to have another account not have to go through authorization, you could just set that flag and immediately authorize the call, and it'll progress. Assuming that is true, which is the default, the first thing we do is we classify the number. And then, like I said, with the exceptions, if it's an emergency or toll-free outbound, we will immediately authorize the call. Okay? The next thing we check are the hard call limits. You can set in an account that you can only make 5 simultaneous calls, regardless of whether they're flat rate, per minute, allotment, etc. So you can have a hard cap on the account. If there's no limits, or if they are under that, if it is exceeded, it immediately gets denied. Provided the hard limit hasn't been reached, we then look at the resource consuming call limit. So again, sort of the subset of that hard call. Have you consumed too many resources with your calls? We will immediately deny the call if you have. Next, we check the allotments. So if you have 400 minutes, we will make sure that you have some base number of minutes available to make this call, and then we will authorize it. If you don't have allotments or you don't have enough left to make this call, then we will check flat rate. And this is where we will check whether it's inbound, outbound, two-way, burst, resource consuming, etc. If it's eligible, oh yeah. The other thing about flat rate trunks is that we have white and blacklist regexes that you can use to determine whether this is an eligible number for a flat rate trunk. For instance, in the US, we would put a whitelist regex on US formatted numbers, which means that only US numbers would be allowed to be flat rated. Does that make sense? Which means any international dialing will never use your flat rate trunks. It will always go down to per minute, okay? Which is usually desirable. However, if you want to support somebody that does a lot of international calling and you want to do flat rate international calling, you would have to modify that whitelist. The other thing is you can do a blacklist, which means, if you don't want them calling Bosnia or, wherever, you can blacklist it and it'll immediately continue on to the per minute validation. Once it hits per minute, then we check to see if you have enough credit. There's a configurable amount of pre-allocation that you can set. So maybe you see if they have 50 cents or whatever available to make the call, and then you basically deduct that 50 cents at the end of the call. You either reimburse them for what they didn't use, or you continue to decrement from their funds. Okay? And so at each of these decision points, you either are authorizing or denying or continuing to the next stage. Am I blowing anybody's minds? Like I said, I tried really hard to think of a way to fancy this up, but I couldn't do it. All right, so some of the behind the curtain stuff. Businessy people, you can probably check email or whatever at this point. I don't know that it'll be much relevant for you. We heard about the MODBs from Carl. So we track transactions in the MODBs. So every time there's a credit or a debit from the funds in your Kazoo account, that creates a transaction in the MODB. And then we can just run a view to sum it all up and figure out what your balance is. At the end of the month, we do a roll up and roll that over into a new transaction for the new MODB. This keeps, as you can imagine, on a very busy account doing a lot of per minute stuff. If we kept this in the regular account database, it would swell and a lot of other services would be impacted, which is one of the reasons we moved it to these MODBs. And again, once the MODBs are no longer relevant, maybe 3 months, 6 months out, you can archive it and take it out of the database entirely, move it into cold storage. Some of the reasons why we're happy with this approach, by doing the rating and authorization in real time, we can proactively combat fraud. Everything being done in parallel means a lot of the caching will be, we'll have warm and hot caches right away, which means we can more quickly determine whether this is a valid call or not. It does scale by the account, so as long as your database cluster can manage it, you should be able to add as many accounts as you need. We have clusters with hundreds of thousands of accounts, so we know that it at least can reach that threshold. And then in Kazoo, we only track funny money, right? That's not tied to any currency of value. You have to do your own billing. With our stuff, we hook into Braintree for credit card processing. Once Braintree has processed the credit card, we add funds to the account. You could hook up external billing systems and do this yourself manually. But it also means, if you have an outage and a customer writes in and noticed it, you can say, we're really sorry, here's $10 of credit to your account. And you can do that right away, quickly and easily. Okay, so I put all of this up on GitHub as a markdown document, so you don't need to take pictures of this or memorize it. It's all up there. But basically, to enable authorization, you would just set in the eCall Manager doc. And sorry for people that aren't familiar with Kazoo, you should come to the training on Wednesday. You'll learn all about this. But basically, you just set the auth enabled flag to true. So now you will start authorizing calls. You can authorize local resource usage by setting the auth local resources flag. With the dry run auth attempts, you can set that to true to dry run them, which means we will go through the whole authorization and rating phase. But regardless of whether it would deny or allow the call will be allowed. Okay, so this is useful for debugging, particularly in a production system if you're going to make changes, so that you can see what the system would have done, but still allow the call so that service isn't impacted, things like that. You can require a rate. So if your rate deck is not handling a particular destination, you can set a flag that we will require there to be rate information on the call, otherwise we'll kill the call, and you'll get an alert about it so that you can fix your rate deck. And then finally, you can have a default authorization action. So if for some reason the Aussie request were to fail, after the timeout, this is what we would allow or deny it by default. Okay. This is what the request looks like via the Crossbar APIs to set the limits. I've obviously omitted all of the options, but hopefully you can infer that if you want to set outbound trunks, you would set a key of outbound trunks, and you don't need it explicitly listed here. But this is what you would do to do that. It's a pretty simple payload. The reseller of the account and the system administrator of the account of the system are the only ones that can make this request successfully. So, obviously it wouldn't make sense to let an account set their limits. And we do have documentation in the Crossbar doc folder for the limits. So you can look at all this stuff later. Once your brains have unmelted from being bored to death by this. Apologies. So all of those keys that you saw, since they're not prefixed by PVT_, they can be set. The other thing you can do, especially as a system administrator, is you can set all of those keys with prefix with PVT_, and now those the limit in that PVT_ field will take precedence over whatever is in the limits doc in the sort of public field. So if I were to do PVT inbound trunks to 5, whereas here it's 11, the account would be limited to 5 trunks. We're still working on making that leak through so that the UI displays 5 instead of 11. But from a back-end perspective, you can limit an account so that they can't set their limits too high. And like I said, the PVT-enabled flag, basically you can short-circuit authorization and immediately allow the call by setting that to false. The wrong way. So on the back end, you can check the limits and the authorization of the current status. So the application is called Johnny 5. So if you've ever seen the movie Short Circuit, we're short-circuiting the call, hence Johnny 5. I know that it's spelled with an H in the movie, but we're lazy, so, well, I'm lazy, so I try to write things short. Carl is not lazy, which is why they're all called maintenance modules, rather than like maint or M or something easy to type. Thanks, Carl. So you can look at the Aussie summary for the system, or you can include the account ID and get the actual account. I have truncated the headings. This is the number of calls. This is the number of resource-consuming calls. These are any allotments that are left. These are the number of trunks, and then the amount of per minute that's left. And then you can see what Johnny 5 thinks the limits are for that particular account. So here they have basically unlimited trunks. They are currently using 3 inbound and 3, oh no, this is duplicated, so it's 3 of both, because it's also a both. This is the amount of credit that's left, and this is whether they can go into post-pay, and if so, how far for post-pay they can go. Okay, so those are a couple of sub-commands that can be helpful there. And again, this is all in the documentation. Adding credit or debiting money from an account, pretty straightforward and simple. You just use credit debit, the account, and the amount. And again, this isn't like US dollars or anything like that. It's just monopoly money. So this could be rubles or yen or some fake currency. Disney dollars. They still do those? I don't know. If you're looking at the logs, you can tell how the call was authorized by looking for these. The call has to be authorized not only by the account's limits, but also by the reseller's limits. And so if either one of those denies the call will be denied. Both have to allow it. So in this case, you can see this call was allowed because it had a flat rate available, and the same with the reseller. In this case, It was a call to an outbound toll-free, and so the call was allowed because the limits were disabled, because it's one of those special cases. But these are the log lines of this form that you would look for to see why a call was or was not allowed. Very exciting. And then in the CDR, you can see that those values are here under the account or reseller billing keys. You can see the rate that was applied, the rate name, the base cost, the number of billing seconds. So this is what you would apply. So this is 10 seconds, at the unit of 49. I won't go into that, don't worry. Whether it used a global resource, no sound please. Whether the channel was authorized. And then the trunk limits, the inbound, outbound, two-way, and burst that were in effect when this call was processed. So those are some of the keys to look for in your CDRs if you want to do additional billing or, run reports. Okay. And that's it. The pain is over.